So we come now to have a look at this next portion of the Epistle of Jude. I just want to remind you of a couple of things. We are looking at this divine tribunal, brothers and sisters, where the certain men crept in unawares are brought before the bar of divine justice. And we saw that all of the things that pertain to a court case, including a jury, are here. And we are the jurors, the ones who have to decide in favour of what Jude is writing, and I think all of us will do that. We saw also that there are three major problems that Jude highlights in verse 4, and we identified these as God's grace being turned to licence, which is going to be our theme for this morning from verses 5 to 8, that the atonement was not lived, they weren't bound by the foot, and we saw that they ignored the demands of God manifestation, the very reason for our calling. We're going to see those things come out in verses 5 to 8 and in the subsequent portions of this epistle. It is the framework around which Jude is going to build his letter. And so what Jude does now in verse 5 is to bring forth his first witnesses. And the first of those, quite appropriately, is Israel in the wilderness, the ecclesia in the wilderness, as they're called by Stephen in Acts chapter 7 and verse 38. Very appropriate because, of course, they were there as types, as Paul says in 1 Corinthians 10, types for us. So what happened to them has happened to us. And so they're brought forth as a witness. And so he says in verse 5, I will therefore put you in remembrance. And we're going to see that that word is picked up from Peter. Though ye once knew this, how that the Lord, and he means of course Yahweh, having saved the people out of the land of Egypt, afterwards destroyed them that believed not. So, when he says, I will put you in remembrance, he's clearly referring back to 2 Peter chapter 1 verse 12, where this same Greek word, hupomimnesko, is used by Peter. And that word in the Greek means to call to one's mind privately and silently by hints or suggestions. That's what the lexicographers will tell you that word means. Well, how's Jude going to do that? Well, he's already inferred the way he will do that when he spoke in verse 3 about, and verse 4 about these people being before of old ordained. In other words, he wants us to go back to Scripture, to go back to the Old Testament, and he's going to show how you can have these things in remembrance. By diligent Bible study. By knowing your Bible well, he says, you're going to see that what's happening to you has happened before. And therefore the way it was successfully handled, if it was successfully handled in the past, that's the way that you can successfully handle this. You're not left alone, brethren. You're not orphans in this regard. You're suffering agony and problems and difficulties in your ecclesia. You're not orphans. It's happened before. And you can find out how to handle these things from the Scriptures. That's his message, brothers and sisters. He's going to remind them of what Peter wrote, and he's going to demonstrate from the Old Testament how to go about handling the difficulties that they confronted. That is the value of Jude's epistle. We can learn a lot from this epistle about how to go about conducting the business of ecclesial life and the affairs of the brotherhood. Especially tomorrow, we're going to see the way in which we should contend earnestly for the faith. There is a way to do it. But he does say then, doesn't he, in verse 5, that I'm going to put you in remembrance, though ye once knew this. Now, I don't know about you, brothers and sisters, but the older I get, the worse my memory becomes. And I think when it comes to spiritual things, my mind is probably like a sieve. I guess I'm not alone in that either. We do tend to forget, don't we? Sometimes conveniently. But we do tend to forget. And so Jude is saying, look, I'm not really telling you anything, brethren, that you don't already know. You once knew this. I'm just reminding you, because it seems as though some have forgotten, because you're not handling these things the way that they ought to be handled. That's why he's writing to them. They're not handling it the way they should be handling it. They're not contending earnestly for the faith, some of them. So he's writing to encourage them to do so. You know, Weymouth translates that phrase, although the whole matter is sufficiently familiar to you. The RSV puts it, though ye were once for all fully informed. Well, he's going to remind them of what happened to Israel, and he's going to draw the example from them that could be useful to them in their own dilemma. And then he says this in verse 5, that the Lord, having saved the people out of the land of Egypt, and they were saved for a purpose. I'd like you to come back with me to Jeremiah chapter 13, brothers and sisters, because Israel was a type for us. And we're going to see that exactly the same thing applies to us as applied to Israel. In Jeremiah 13 verse 11, we have the reason that God saved them out of Egypt. Well, you might say the reason was that he was fulfilling the promise to Abraham. True. Yes, that was true. But there was another reason. And he points it out to us in Jeremiah 13 verse 11. For as the girdle cleaveth to the loins of a man, so have I caused to cleave unto me the whole house of Israel and the whole house of Judah, saith Yahweh. So here's your reason why God has caused Judah and Israel to cleave unto him. He says, that they might be unto me for a people, and for a name, and for a praise, and for a glory, but they would not hear. So when God called Israel out of Egypt, it wasn't just to fulfill the promise to Abraham. It was that he might have a people that would give him glory, that a people that could bear his name, that when the nations looked at them, they would say, I can see their God. I can see their God in the way they behave. And Paul says the same thing to the Corinthians in 2 Corinthians 6 verse 16. He says, God has called you that he might walk about in you. That's why he calls the ecclesia, as he does to Timothy, an ecclesia of living God. It's not the ecclesia of that living God, it's an ecclesia of living God. I will be in them, and to use the Greek, literally, I will walk about in them. 2 Corinthians 6, verse 16. We are called to be a praise, to be a name-bearing community, that God might receive the glory, not only now, faintly, but fully in the kingdom age, when our weaknesses and frailties have been removed. And all that remains is a perfected character, a character that had begun in probation, to be developed to a point that there was a true reflection of deity in his people, in the way they behaved themselves. That, brothers and sisters, is why Israel was called. And so Jude reminds his readers of that. We can come back to Jude. Israel failed to comprehend that purpose, and they turned their glory, says Psalm 106, into an image made like unto a calf, to a beast. Of course, in the events of Exodus 32. But then he uses this word afterwards. Afterward, he destroyed them that believed not. Now, this is the Greek deuteros, and it means the second time. So Yahweh acted twice. He saved Israel. He brought them out of Egypt. They were baptized unto Moses in the Red Sea. They went through, like you and I are going through, a wilderness journey. And we're about to cross the Jordan. Jordan is going to run back the other way as far as we're concerned, through Adam. Mortality will be gone. We will have the baptism of the Spirit, having 40 years, as it were earlier, like Israel, the baptism of water in the Red Sea. That was the pattern. So God saved the people, but they never got into the land, that wilderness generation. Everybody 20 and above perished in the wilderness, except for a handful, as we know. That was the problem. He acted twice. He saved, and then, because of their faithlessness, he destroyed. What was the problem? Well, he tells us what the problem was in the last words of verse 5. He destroyed them that believed not. Everything, brothers and sisters, depends on faith, doesn't it? Everything depends on faith. And that word pistuo means to believe, to be persuaded, to have trust, to have reliance. And we know how important faith is. We will not be in the kingdom any more than that wilderness generation will be if we don't have faith, a faith that was absent from the bulk of them. So what was the real problem? What were the problems that brought that wilderness generation to disaster? Well, there were at least three. Israel turned God's grace into license. They saw their deliverance from Egypt as essentially a bondage. You know what they said when they came out of Egypt? Well, we want to go back there. You brought us out here to die. It's like us saying you brought us into the truth that we might have a miserable life and perish. They saw themselves as being in bondage in the wilderness. They turned God's grace into license to return to the old way. Make us a captain that we might return to Egypt. They wanted to go back to the old way. You can do that, and far too many do, don't they? Far too many do. Their second problem was that they denied Yahweh by their walk. They ignored the principles of the atonement. They were not bound by the foot. And their third problem was that they rejected the purpose of their call. And they were called, as we saw in Jeremiah 13, for the purpose of manifesting their God. So the three issues that came out of verse 4 are seen here in the wilderness generation. That's not by accident, because he's going to do exactly the same thing in the next verse. When you get to verse 6, and the angels which kept not their first estate, but left their own habitation, he hath reserved in everlasting chains under darkness, under the judgment of the great day. He's speaking here, of course, about Korah, Dathan, and Abiram. Now, the word angels here is angelos. It's actually spelled in the Greek with two G's. I'm not quite sure why, but anyway, it's angelos, from which we get angel in the English. And it means a messenger. And of course, we know the word can be used both of immortal angels, immortal messengers, and it can refer, of course, to mortal messengers. And there are various references you can look up in that regard. And I'm not going to go through those now because I think most of us accept that that's the case. This is a reference to prominent people in Israel in that wilderness generation who have been the subject of verse 5. And we know, of course, that in Genesis 6 verse 1, there are the sons of God who were clearly from the line of Seth, those who had held the truth, who married into the world and brought about the disaster of the flood. It says that they kept not their first estate. Now, this word here, kept, terio, was used back in verse 1. It's the word that's got to do with keeping or preserving. They kept not their first estate. It was an important responsibility. And by first estate, the word is only one Greek word, arche, means beginning or commencement. And Rotherham and the RV in the margin use the term principality. So they kept not the appointment that they had received from God. They had received an elevated position by God's selection, these people, but they were not happy with it. They were not content with it. They wanted something more. And we're going to see, of course, that the leader of that was the Iceman, Korah. That's what his name means, the Iceman. He's a cool character, was Korah. And he wanted to be the captain. Make us a captain, they said in Numbers chapter 14. Make us a captain to lead us back to Egypt. And Korah wanted to be that captain. And of course his record is in Numbers 16, just a chapter or so beyond. So he was going to lead them back into Egypt. It says here in verse 6 that they left their own habitation. They left it behind. And this own habitation, Weymouth translates it, they deserted their proper abode. Rotherham says they had forsaken their proper dwelling. Now, who was involved in it? I want you to come back to Numbers 16 and have a look and see who's involved in this rebellion. Numbers 16. And we read in verse 1 of Numbers 16, now Korah, the son of Izhar, the son of Kohath, the son of Levi, and Dathan and Abiram, the sons of Eliab, and On, the son of Peleth, sons of Reuben, took men, and they rose up before Moses. Now in Numbers chapter 2, verses 10 to 16, we are told where Reuben was to have his encampment. When Israel was organised at Sinai, Reuben was to be on the southern side of the tabernacle at the right hand or eastern end. And we also know from Numbers chapter 3 and verse 29 that Levi, the families of Levi, including the family of Kohath, were to have their encampment on the southern side of the tabernacle, next door to the tribe of Reuben. And that's curious, it's interesting, because there's a point to be made about that, as we will see. And so Jude tells us that they were held, that the judgment came and they were held in everlasting chains under darkness. I want you to stay in number 16 because we want to have a look and see what happens here. Because these chains are referred to in Numbers chapter 16, verses 30 and 31. Now, I don't need to tell you the whole story, but the time comes when Moses says to Israel, separate yourselves from these rebels. And in verse 30, he says this, but if Yahweh make a new thing in the earth, open her mouth and swallow them up with all that appertaineth unto them, and they go down quick, that is, meaning alive, because that's the Hebrew word K, C-H-A-Y. If they go down alive into the pit, then ye shall understand that these men have provoked Yahweh. Well, that's exactly what happened in verse 31. And it came to pass, as he'd made an end of speaking all these words, that the ground clave asunder that was under them. Now, there's no more awful feeling than that, is there? Those who come from California know what it's like when the ground is shaking under your feet. You know, it is the most awful feeling that you can go through. Because, I mean, that's terra firma, isn't it? We sort of rely upon terra firma. And what you've got to do, brothers and sisters, when you read a record like this, is to use your imaginations. You've got this vast company that have collected around Korah. I mean, Korah and those who support him with the incense in their censers. They are actually fried to chips by fire from heaven. But those who have collected around the rebels, their destiny is to go down into the earth. Now what happens is, and you can imagine what this would have done to the nation, is that as soon as Moses has spoken the words, there's this crack. And a vast chasm opens up. And people that were standing on terra firma are all of a sudden going down at 120 miles an hour into the abyss. And I sort of imagine it. They wouldn't have sort of gone down and said, oh, I always wanted to fly. They would have been screaming, ah! And then the earth goes, crunch. Just like they smash up those motor vehicles, you know, with a splat. Got a picture? Lunch will be served in half an hour. That's the picture. Reserved in age, not everlasting, because they're coming out again. They're coming out again for the judgment seat of Christ, which will be held in that very same place, Mount Sinai. They won't be too far away from the judgment seat when they're resurrected. They're there in age-lasting chains, under darkness, waiting for the day of judgment. Krisis, the word means the process of judgment. The trial, which we're going through in Jude's epistle. The sentence, which we make at the end of it. The execution, pushed to the left and herded off into oblivion. That's where they're going because of their rebellion. And it will all happen in this great day great day contrasts with the darkness in which they're locked up. It will be the day of revelation of characters and the resolution of destiny. That's what Jude's talking about. Now, what has sometimes been suggested is that the angels of Jude verse 6 are supernatural angels. Well, I just want to say a word about that. We had to look at that word angels. It is used both of immortal angels and human messengers in the New Testament. And the one thing we do know is this, brothers and sisters, is that immortal angels do not sin. And I'm very thankful for that. Because Christ says in Luke 20 verse 36 that the immortals will be as the angels. And if immortal angels can sin, then I'm not sure I really want immortality. It doesn't sound very attractive to me if immortal angels can sin, because that's what we are going to become, the angels of the future age. We shall be like unto them. There is no such thing as a sinning immortal angel. That's a furphy of Christianity, is it not? Their wrong doctrine on the matter of immortal souls, etc., and their interpretation of the apocalypse. The judgment of the great day is the judgment seat of Christ. The angels, the immortal angels, are going to gather the responsible to it, first raising the dead and then coming and collecting us. They themselves will not stand personally before that judgment seat. They will do the marshalling. They will do the herding. They will do the interviews. They will do in their final task, except for teaching us to take over their role thereafter. Their final task, we're told in Matthew 13, is to herd the rejected away, after the rejected have seen those on the right hand immortalised in the presence of Christ. That, brothers and sisters, is their role. They're not going to be standing in front of the judgment seat. And it says that they're held beneath the earth. Well, there is no place beneath the earth where immortal beings can be imprisoned. So you can forget that. This is not a reference in Jude verse 6, to which we can return, by the way. It's not a reference to immortal angels. It's a reference to people very much like ourselves, who wanted to go back to Egypt, who wanted to go back to the world, to put it in modern language. And Korah, the Iceman, was going to lead them back there. Now, this is what they did. Here we've got the meaning of this man's name. You can see there, bald, well, I guess I qualify. Ice or frost. He was a first cousin to Moses and Aaron. And when you look at that structure there, I'm not going to go through it in detail, you can see there, can't you, that Aaron and Moses were the product of Amram, Aaron being the older brother by several years. And the next son of Kohath was Izhar. And Izhar had 3 sons. And one of those, the oldest, was Korah. He had 2 brothers, Nepheg and Zichri. So they were first cousins to Aaron and Moses. Now, there's something about families, isn't there? Siblings and families. You belong to a family, you sort of feel as though, well, I'm equal. I've got an equality. I mean, he's my cousin. Why should he be superior to me? I'm just as good as him. And that, of course, is what they said. Hath God spoken only through you? What about us? We've been appointed to a lofty position. Well, they weren't content with it. They did have a lofty position. They were there on the southern side of the tabernacle, just around the corner from Moses and Aaron, who were here on the eastern side. So there's Moses and Aaron. Here's Korah, son of Kohath. But guess who's next door to him? Well, the tribe of Reuben. And Dathan and Abiram and On came from the tribe of Reuben. So you can guess what was happening in those cool nights in the wilderness. They'd light a little campfire there, somewhere here, between the encampment of Korah and Dathan, out in this area here. They'd light their little campfire and they'd sit around and start grumbling about their brethren and grumbling about Moses and the AB, that awful arranging body. They're always making decisions I don't like. You know, do I need to say any more? None of us here would ever do that. None of us in this room would ever do that. We wouldn't club around with our brethren and sisters, sort of, you know, sitting in a corner saying, oh, I don't like brother so-and-so. We'd never do that. Sadly, human beings are brilliant at that. That's the sad part. We're brilliant at it. And it led, over time, to the rebellion of Korah, Dathan and Abiram. Do you know, brothers and sisters, that in 38 years there are only 2 incidents recorded? From the time they were condemned in Numbers 14 to the time they got to Kadesh Barnea, there are just 2 incidents recorded in Israel. One was the rebellion of Korah, Dathan and Abiram, which seems huge, and it is huge. And the other one was the man found gathering sticks on the Sabbath day, which seems very minor, but they were the same. They were exactly the same. Because the man who was found gathering sticks had got up that morning and said, I'm not going to obey the Sabbath law. I don't care about God's rest. I'm going to go and gather sticks. And Yahweh said, stone him to death. And that's exactly what happened to the nation who didn't want to go into his rest, isn't it? They perished like that man in the wilderness. So that's why Jude's back here. He's telling us something about the problems. Now it says in verse 19 of Jude that one of the characteristics of the class that he's talking about in this letter is that they separated themselves. And of course, that's what Korah, Dathan and Abiram did. And they said, let us make us a captain, Israel said. And of course, Korah put his hand up and aspired to the leadership in Israel. He wanted to take over the eastern side. He wanted to evict Moses and Aaron from here and take over their position. They left their first estate, says Jude. They wanted a higher position, and they wanted it for a purpose, to lead Israel back to Egypt. So what's Korah's problems? What's the essence of his failure, brothers and sisters? Well, he turned the grace that had been given to him of a prominent position in Israel into license to rebel against Moses and Aaron, and especially against Yahweh. He turned God's grace into license. He walked in pride, in jealousy and envy. He denied the principles of the atonement in his life, which is all about crushing self, crushing human nature. He denied that. And he forsook the responsibility of teaching and upholding Yahweh's ways. He failed to manifest God to Israel. He was appointed to that position. He was a teacher. Levites were intended to be teachers and to give an example to Israel. What a privilege that was, to manifest God to his own people. And he wasn't content with it. He didn't understand the reason for the appointment that he had received. So having dealt with the wilderness generation and a certain class in it, Jude strangely now brings up Sodom and Gomorrah. Hang on. Huh? It's like sort of talking about the brotherhood today and then saying, well, let's go to New Orleans for whatever festival. That's ridiculous, isn't it? It's not ridiculous, as we're going to see. But why bring up Sodom and Gomorrah in verse 7? Let's read Jude verse 7. Even as Sodom and Gomorrah and the cities about them in like manner, giving themselves over to fornication and going after strange flesh, are set forth for an example, suffering the vengeance of eternal fire. Now you see, the problem with Sodom and Gomorrah was, just like it is in the world today, is that permissiveness is a highly contagious disease. It's true, isn't it? It's a deadly, contagious disease. It's even creeping in amongst us, sadly. And so the world today is pervaded by this disease. And because they're getting away with it, and they're glorified, and they're justified, and the courts of law are approving of their behaviour, everybody else thinks they can do it. There's no restrictions. We've got this ridiculous situation now where, having agreed, or at least some states in America having agreed to what they call gay marriage, I don't like the term, but that's what they call it, homosexual marriage, we've now got a situation where 3 women want to be united in marriage. Well, why not a dozen? Why not make marriage a dozen people? All right, how ridiculous is that? So it's spreading like a disease through the whole world. It's another sign, brothers and sisters, that we are near the end. Make no mistake about that. How long do you think God's going to tolerate this? Well, there came a time when he would tolerate it no longer. And he blew Sodom and Gomorrah off the face of the earth. And that's what Jude talks about here. Now, he describes this as fornication. It's ek porneio. Now, ek intensifies the meaning of a word, like epi does. If I take off ek from the front of that word, and I take off euo from the end of it, the suffix, what have you got? I won't even mention the name, won't mention the word. You can see it. Excessive indulgence in immorality. That's what that word means. But there's a certain kind of immorality. It says they were going after. The Interlinear Bible says going away after. And he calls it strange flesh. Rotherham translates it other kind of flesh. And Paul tells us what other kind of flesh in Romans chapter 1 and verse 27. Men working with men. And then he adds women to it. That's what they were doing. So what did God do to them? Well, he made an example of them. He says, "Are set forth for an example, suffering the vengeance of eternal fire." They were an example of what God does to that kind of behaviour. They were obliterated. Suffering, hupiko, means to hold under, to undergo. Vengeance, that which proceeds out of justice, God's justice, not man's. And then he describes it as being eternal fire. Now, this doesn't mean fire, of course, that burns forever and a day. In 2 Peter chapter 2 and verse 6, Peter tells us that Sodom and Gomorrah were turned into ashes. So the fire was out. All that was left was ashes. In Lamentations 4 and verse 6, we read that Sodom was overthrown as in a moment. Well, it wasn't a moment, was it? But they disappeared as though it was in a moment. So the eternal fire here is not a continually burning fire. It's the fire that will destroy Rome. Revelation 11 verse 8, 14:10, 18 verse 4 and verse 8. The same language is used of Babylon the Great, Rome of the latter days. You will not find a skerrick of Rome left when Christ and the saints have dealt the death blow to that system. They will be gone forever. That's what God does, he says. That's what he does. So don't think you can just smile at this. The kind of behaviour of these certain men crept in unawares who've got liberty, equality and fraternity. Don't think you can just smile at that. Because God has shown what he's going to do to it. And he'll do it again. So what had Sodom and Gomorrah done? Well, they had turned God's grace into licence, hadn't they? So how did Sodom and Gomorrah, or at least Sodom, how did they receive God's grace in any form? Well, in Genesis 13 verse 10, a Christadelphian ecclesia was set up in the city of Sodom, which had at least 50 members. Because Abraham pleads with God, if there's 50 left. We know there's only one, but he began with 50 at least. It had 50 members, this Christadelphian ecclesia. It was called the Sodom ecclesia. And if you had the directory of that day, you could have looked it up. Here's the ecclesia at Sodom. Members. Lot, the faithful. List off the members. Right? The very presence of the Christadelphian ecclesia in Sodom was divine grace. He was saying to them, there's a different way of life. And Lot himself stood in the gate, didn't he? He sat in the gate. You reckon Lot smiled at the behaviour he saw? Of course, he rebuked it. He rebuked it. And they didn't like him for that. this one would come in here and set himself up as a judge. They hated him for it. But like Noah, who built an ark to the saving of his house, and by that he condemned the world, says Paul, so Lot and his ecclesia in Sodom were condemning the world. That's why, brothers and sisters, it's very important for us to be putting forth the message. You know, most ecclesias around the world today will not touch the subject of homosexuality. One ecclesia in Melbourne did it. They had their windows smashed. They had people standing out picketing them on a Sunday morning. They won't touch it for that reason. But we should be making it quite plain to the world, privately and publicly, where we have the opportunity, that God is going to destroy the wicked of this civilization as he did Sodom and Gomorrah. The presence of that ecclesia was divine grace. But there was another thing, because Christadelphians came on the scene, didn't he? In Genesis 14. And he took the king of Sodom and many of his people and Lot and his family. He took them into captivity. He took them right up to the north of the land of Canaan, to Dan. And Abraham pursued after them. And then they came back after the destruction of Christadelphians. And there was Melchizedek. And in the presence of Melchizedek, Abraham repudiates the king of Sodom and all that belongs to him. You know what the king of Sodom said to Abraham? He says, you can keep all the wealth, all the booty, just give me the souls. Just give me the people. That's what King Sin wants. He wants bodies. He wants people that he can put in chains. Just give me the bodies. You can take all the rest. Abraham says, that's yours. I won't touch a thing of it. And he swore an oath in the presence of Yahweh that he wouldn't touch anything that belonged to the king of Sodom. That was a rebuke to the king of Sodom, for which, of course, he became an enemy of Abraham. That's why Yahweh says to Abraham, don't worry, Abraham, I'm your shield. I'll look after you. But that should have been, shouldn't it? It should have been something that alerted the king of Sodom that he couldn't keep going on the way he was, but he did. He turned God's grace into license. No repentance. Continue to spread the contagion. What about Sodom and Gomorrah? Well, they despised the principle of restraint that they saw in both Lot and in Abraham. They saw the atonement at work in those two men, and they despised it. And what was their third problem? Well, they rejected Lot's and Abraham's example of godliness, because those two men understood the reason for their call. But that was rejected by Sodom and Gomorrah. So the very same three problems that Jude's highlighted in verse 4 are seen in the case of Sodom and Gomorrah. But why Sodom and Gomorrah? Why choose these two cities to illustrate a problem that was going on within the brotherhood? Why would you do that? Well, because it's scriptural. That's why. The answer is in Isaiah 1 verse 10. Have a look at it. Now, there are two addresses in Isaiah 1, which we know is a chapter written probably as a preface after the rest of the book had been written. So it's a summary chapter in many ways. And it begins in verse 2 with the call through the prophet Isaiah. Hear, O heavens, meaning the rulers of Israel, or Judah in this case to be particular, and give ear, O earth, meaning the people of Judah. But have a look at verse 10. In the second address, it's different. Hear the word of Yahweh, ye rulers of Sodom, meaning the heavens of verse 2, the rulers of Judah, and give ear unto the law of our God, ye people of Gomorrah, meaning the earth of verse 2. Got it? When Yahweh looks at his ecclesia, Judah, it's got leprosy, as we're told in verse 5, 4, 5 and 6. It's got leprosy. And he calls them by their true name. Sodom and Gomorrah. They were the brotherhood of Christ. And one of the saddest things, and I've had a few sad things happen in my life, one of the saddest things that I ever heard, which I just had to prove was true, I found it hard to believe, was that there is such a thing as a Christadelphian homosexual website. You've got no idea how I felt about that. When the world types in the name Christadelphian, one of the sites that may come up is Christadelphian homosexual website. What would you do if you were God sitting in heaven? What would you call your people? Sodom and Gomorrah. Sad, isn't it? That's why Jude uses Sodom and Gomorrah. But there was a man there who had super agony. His name was Lot the Faithful. I haven't got time to take you to 2 Peter 2 verses 6 to 9, but you know it as well as I do. He tortured his righteous soul from day to day with the error of the wicked. The day of deliverance came. The Lord knows how to deliver the godly out of temptation, says Peter. And he does. He can get us through it, brothers and sisters, because we're going through what Christ said we'd go through. Likewise also as it was in the days of Lot, even thus shall it be in the day when the Son of Man is revealed. So let's just conclude this morning. In verse 5 we have Israel who are improperly converted 2 years into their probation out of the book of life. In verse 6 we've got Korah, Dathan and Abiram, ungrateful response to the privileged position that they were given. In verse 7 we have Sodom and Gomorrah, unheeding of rebuke. Those were the issues of the time. And in verse 8 he says this in Jude. In verse 8, as we go back to the epistle of Jude, he writes, likewise also these filthy dreamers defile the flesh, despise dominion, and speak evil of dignities. Now the word filthy is not in the text. The 20th century New Testament says, yet in the very same way these men too cherishing vain dreams. And what he's going to do here in verse 8 is to summarise the content of verses 5 to 7 related to these false brethren of verse 4. In their dreamings, says Rotherham, they were dreamers. They were dreaming about the way that they could continue to exercise liberty, equality and fraternity. And then he says this, they defile the flesh like Sodom. They despise dominion. Weymouth says they set authority at naught, like Korah, Dathan and Abiram. They speak evil of dignities. The two Greek words are blasphemo, which you can see as blasphemy, doxis, glory. Literally, they blaspheme glories. Like Israel, who blasphemed God's glory in manifestation 10 times, he says in Numbers 14, for which they were condemned. But why? Why do you think, brothers and sisters, that Jude puts these in the reverse order? He starts with Sodom, then he goes to Korah, Dathan and Abiram, and then he goes to Israel. But that's the reverse order from verses 5 to 7. I want to make a suggestion. It's there for you and me in the latter days. Just like that's there for you. It's there for the latter days. Because you see, verse 7 is about liberty. Verse 6 is about equality. And verse 5 is about fraternity. They're the problems of our day. Liberty, equality, and fraternity. So it's over to you, Brother Stephen. Christ and humanism, 7:15, here, in this place. this evening.